Hello and welcome to week 10 of 52 in Old Testament Survey. This week we're going to be looking at the birth of Isaac and the testing of the faith of Abraham. Just to give you a quick recap, last week we came on the scene about 10 years after God had promised Abraham that he was going to make him into a mighty nation. He was going to bless him, and Abraham was wavering in his faith. And he basically questioned God and said he had no heir to his house. God promised him that he would give him an heir from his own body. But about a year later, after that, 11 years after the original promise, Sarah doubted and told Abraham that God wasn't going to give her a child by her own body. So she gave Abraham Hagar to take as a wife, and she bore him a son named Ishmael. Now, Ishmael was not the promised seed, as Isaac was to be later, as God foretold, but God still is honoring his covenant for Abraham. Tonight we come on the scene. It's now been 25 years since the original promise. And before we get into our study, let's, as tradition, recite the 8 stages of the Old Testament so we can continue the memorization process. Primeval, patriarchal, bondage and deliverance, conquests and judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, exile, and return. Let's open up our story in Genesis chapter 22 at the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Verse 1, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him." Notice it says the Lord visited Sarah, and also at the time that God had set forth himself. This time was no mistake by the Lord. He didn't wait too long. He knew exactly how long he was going to take to fulfill his word. Why he didn't tell Abraham? Well, it's a faith thing. And by the testing of Abraham's faith, it establishes him as a man, and he becomes sanctified more back into the image of God. Shortly after God fulfills his word, Abraham's faith was tested. Look in Genesis chapter 22. "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you.'" Now, as 1 Chronicles chapter 3 tells us, Mount Moriah later is where Solomon's temple was to be built. It's also the place where David made a sacrifice unto God after God had brought judgment on him for numbering the people of Israel. This place is also the place where the Dome of the Rock currently sits today, but one day this place again will be used by God in the end times. So back to the main part of this story, the fact that God asked Abraham to sacrifice his own son, today in our time would be shocking, right? We'd question whether or not we were crazy. In Abraham's day, though, human sacrifice was something that took place regularly. So as crazy as that is, Abraham probably would not have been shocked that God asked him to do this. Now, one of the things I've wondered about the ancient world is, why was this happening? Well, people were trying to appease God or the gods because inherently within themselves, they knew that something was wrong and that God's wrath was being poured out upon them, and they were trying to appease God or the gods, as distorted as their view was, by sacrificing a human being. So there's some knowledge that had been passed down to these people that led them to believe that they could atone for their own sins. The problem is, the people they were sacrificing were born into sin as well, and were also guilty of breaking God's law. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Then in verse 7, Isaac said, Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. So notice 2 things here in the text. The first thing is, when he was speaking to his servants, he said, We will come back to you after we're done worshiping. The second thing is that when Isaac questioned him, he said that God will provide himself the lamb. Now, this isn't something that the text tells us, but I believe that as God had been causing Abraham to wait all of those years, the 25 years for Isaac to be born, and now it's been, as some people speculate, maybe even up to as many as 30 years. Isaac may be as old as 30 years old in this portion of the text. That in that time, Abraham's faith was developed as he was sanctified towards God, as God was long-suffering towards him in the fulfillment of his promise. Abraham also was being formed, and his faith was being developed in his character. And he was starting to realize that God would be faithful, and he needed to trust in the Lord, that he would fulfill his promise, and that Isaac was that seed despite the test that he's being given right now. We'll see other tests like this as well as we continue in the Old Testament, where God will take the children of Israel up to the moment before he shows them what he will do to provide. Verse 9, Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here am I. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide. As it is to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This is an amazing text. We saw earlier in Abraham's walk with the Lord, he believed God enough that he was to follow him into Egypt. But then when he got there, he feared man instead of God. And so he told everybody that Sarah was his sister so that he wouldn't be killed. He did it again with Abimelech. He said that Sarah was his sister to spare his own life so that he wouldn't be killed. Then again we see Abraham taking things into his own hands with Ishmael. But here in this text, we see God take him to the very end, almost to the death of his own son. The whole thing he had waited for all these years. The 25 years until his birth and potentially 30 years now, if that's how old Isaac is. So potentially 55 years of promise. Everything that Abraham had lived for on the altar before God. Knife in hand, ready to end it all. The whole promise, because he trusted God. And God tested to see if he feared God more than man or more than anything else that had been put before him. Would he follow him? Would the patriarch, the father of Israel, follow God and fear him above all else to the point of destroying the very thing that he had had his hope in? Verse 16, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So God had an ultimate plan. Salvation was not going to be dependent upon Abraham or Isaac or upon Isaac, but God was testing Abraham. And Isaac is a type of Christ. He was the promised one that God had foretold that would come. But ultimately, Isaac too was born into sin, and sacrificing him would do nothing to atone for Abraham's wrong. We see the faithfulness of God as he provided the lamb, which is a foreshadowing of what he later would do through Jesus Christ. So as we break off into our groups, I hope you enjoy the study. Take your time in the questions. And also, I would advise for you to spend some time in this passage throughout the rest of the week, just meditating on what God did and how God may also be moving in your life in a similar way. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or also you could post them directly onto the blog. Other than that, I'll see you next week, and have a fantastic week.